Bishop John Taylor, former Bishop of St Albans. Bishop John, could you please explain the life and ministry of Charles Simeon in nurturing two generations of evangelical Anglican clergy with a positive attitude towards the Jewish people and their restoration?
Well, here we are in Charles Simeon's church, Holy Trinity Church in Cambridge, where he came first having just been ordained at the age of 23 and was appointed vicar here in the November of that year, having only spent 6 months as a curacy in the next door parish. And he came here and stayed here for 54 years. To start with, he received a great deal of opposition and hostility. They even locked the box pews so that the people couldn't come in to hear him when he wanted to preach a special series of sermons on a Sunday afternoon. But he had to bring benches in, and then they removed the benches. It was hostility personified when he was brought here, perhaps because he was young, but more particularly, I think, because he preached a personal religion, which was quite a new thing for the church of his day. But nevertheless, he won through. And as I say, for 54 years, he exercised his ministry here. He never became a bishop, but then his influence was far greater than any bishop, because here he was in the center of this university city, and he had virtually 50% of the intelligentsia of Great Britain coming through his hands, the other half, of course, being in Oxford. And so he was able to influence them, to teach them, and to touch their lives. And thousands of people went out from here, many into the ordained ministry, but others into other occupations. A number went out as missionaries overseas, all tinged and touched by the influence of a great man of God, whose essential was a person who believed in the centrality of Jesus Christ, the authority of Holy Scripture, and the necessity for personal holiness. And that personal holiness was the feature that was relatively new in the life of the Church of England at the time. Yes, it's been brought to birth very much by John and Charles Wesley, but the Church of England had virtually driven the Wesleyans out into Methodism. But within the church, Charles Simeon did for the Church of England what they had done for what are now the free churches.
From whence came Charles Simeon's great interest in the Jewish people and their restoration?
Charles Simeon was essentially a Bible man, and therefore his concern was for the spread of biblical teaching throughout the church, and that meant not only spreading the gospel in missionary service to other parts of the world, and for that reason he was involved in the foundation of the Church Missionary Society, and also for the London Jews Society, and also for the British and Foreign Bible Society. So he was one of the centre people in the great missionary expansion of the 19th century. His particular concern for the Jews was essentially because he held to what the Bible held. Now that's an unusual thing to say, because you'd have thought, well, everybody's reading the Bible, and so they know what the Bible says. But not so. You see, preaching in the Church of England in the 19th century, at that particular time, was more particularly about rationalism, about morality, and very little about Christian doctrine, the doctrine of salvation, the call of God, the Great Commission, and all that. And so when he taught people that, and he was a marvelous preacher and a great teacher. In fact, he preached here twice on a Sunday, sometimes 3 times, but he also had people in his rooms in King's College, where he was a fellow, and had sermon classes there. And so he trained people how to preach. His own sermons, 2,500 of them, all printed up, are available, and I've got one of them here, at least one of the books of sermons. There are 20 more books like this in the vestry here of this church. And there you'll see something of his heart for the Jewish people. Not only for the Jewish people, but that was an essential part of biblical teaching. And so he says the reason that he appealed to the church of his day to remember the Jews is because God loved them. He quotes, "See how wonderfully God speaks about the Jewish people. He calls them the dearly beloved of my soul. He says, I will plant them in their own land assuredly with my whole heart and with my whole soul. And again he says, he will rejoice over them with joy, and they shall be a name and a praise among all the people of the earth. Now that's a quotation from one of his very last sermons, when he was almost given his dying wish to the church to say what he really feels. So his longing and his love for the Jews was unique, and it influenced not only him, but a couple of generations of people after him.
Bishop John, one of the positives of that period of time was the role of the Clapham Sect in British political and ecclesiastical circles. What was Simeon's relationship with the Clapham Sect and with William Wilberforce in particular?
We do know this, that Wilberforce and Simeon were born the same year, so they were contemporaries. They would maybe even have known each other at school, at Eton. They certainly would have known each other and been aware of each other. And there is constant contact between the two of them. In fact, Wilberforce writes a letter to Charles Simeon saying how sorry he is that he can't be with Simeon at one particular occasion, and he expresses his regard for Simeon as a man with an intense love for God. So clearly there was a strong relationship between them. I think the link was probably through Henry Venn. Henry Venn was rector of Yelling, which is a village just outside Cambridge, and he was one of the founders with Charles Simeon of the Church Missionary Society, and he was one of the key people also in the Clapham Sect. So undoubtedly Simeon would have had links with Wilberforce, with the Clapham Sect generally, and with all those social reformers in Victorian and pre-Victorian England. So the influence of Simeon's Bible teaching and his emphasis on personal holiness and the implication of personal holiness in social concern was the mainspring for the whole Victorian concept of social welfare, of caring for the poor, of taking the gospel not only to this country but to the ends of the earth, and of course for the abolition of slavery was an aspect of that, but only one aspect of it, and so much of it.
Both Wilberforce and Simeon were founding members, or coming in about the time when the London Jew Society, CMJ, was founded. Could you elaborate a bit upon their involvement with CMJ?
Well, Simeon was one of the founders of the CMJ, of the London Jew Society. Anything of that nature, of a biblical and evangelical nature, he would throw his lot in with, because he was on the network. It must have been a network of people who knew each other and they shared common concerns. It wasn't restricted to a handful of Church of England people, and Quakers and other people were also involved in many of the great events that Charles Simeon supported. But Charles Simeon himself would see this as an important thing, having founded and helped to found the CMS with Henry Venn and with others. So when it came to the Jew Society, he would have been there in the front row at the very beginning. And of course, through him, other people would have been involved. You see, there wasn't such a thing as the evangelical party in the Church of England, but there were a large number of people who were described maybe a bit contemptuously as Simeonites. And it was all this great, vast group of Simeonites who were the people who followed in Simeon's lead. He was a great influence on people.
From the very beginning, Bishop John, there were lots of people of prominence involved with CMJ, London Jew Society, not just Wilberforce, but the Duke of Kent was the patron for a while. Do you have any idea why, in such a short period of time, the London Jew Society became very popular amongst the higher classes of British society?
Oh, I think it was Simeon's influence and the influence of all his fellow evangelically minded people, because here was a challenge. At last, a solution was being found to the Jewish question, a solution that was positive, that was charitable, that was Christian, and that wasn't dismissive. And so I can well understand that as this evangelical, biblical influence worked through Victorian England, so people would say, this is something that we must support. We support CMS, we must support CMJ as well. Of course we must. And you could quite easily say, well, the whole gospel is to the Jew first and also to the Greek, and so to the Jew first. Let's make sure that we fulfill this part of the commitment of the New Testament. to the world outside.
So if we summate what's been said so far, we can see that at the beginning of the 19th century, Charles Simeon was one of a few people who had this interest within the Anglican Church, the Church of England. But by the end of his ministry, let's say the 1830s and 40s, through Simeon, plus others, it became much more widespread.
Indeed, indeed. I mean, typical is the way in which Simeon ended his days here. 54 years in this church, and when he died, the funeral was in King's College Chapel. When he died, the whole city closed down, all the shops shut, and hundreds of people streamed towards King's College Chapel for his funeral. And if you go to King's College Chapel today, there's no memorial to Charles Simeon there. There's one here, but there in the floor of King's College Chapel is a little plaque which says C.S. and the year, Charles Simeon. He is one of the most important people in the life of the Church of England over the past 250 years.
Bishop John, today there's quite a bit of negativity towards the empire, the British Empire, or the abuses of the British Empire. But if Charles Simeon was involved in training up and sending out lots of missionaries to work within the British Empire, that must have been something positive also, wasn't there?
Oh yes, I mean it was with the Bible and the sword, people say, that the British expanded. Yes, it was. Colonialism went with armies and went with gunboats and so forth, but along with that went trade, and along with that went people saying, here are the opportunities, we're opening up new lands, we must take the gospel, the church must go there as well. And so they did, and the emphasis on the need for evangelizing the world, which stemmed from here and from the evangelical movement, that went alongside. So there's the other side as well. So even though we may look with a certain amount of shame at some of the things that were done in the name of the British Empire, we also have to look back with pride and with thanksgiving for the people who went, and many of them sacrificed their lives going out there, because it wasn't healthy living on the west coast of Africa. It wasn't healthy being in some of the places that the empire expanded. But Christian people went out there, ministers went out there, under CMS, under CMJ, under other organizations, and the free churches were doing it as well, the Baptist Missionary Society and the Methodist Missionary Society. They all did it, and they went alongside. And sometimes they benefited from the protection that came from the British military, but nevertheless, they didn't need the protection, and they certainly didn't have protection against all the bugs and the plagues and the other things to which they succumbed. But they went essentially with the love of Jesus Christ. And let's never forget that.
In 1917, the British government issued what's known as the Balfour Declaration. And there were quite a few Anglican bishops who showed a certain degree of support for that. Now, obviously, they had some awareness of the biblical you might say, mandate for Israel's restoration. Could you comment briefly about that, and especially the little protocol that came out in 1918?
Yes, there's a long prehistory to the Balfour Declaration, of course, because throughout the whole of the 19th century, there was this sympathy that I've been speaking about that built up for the Jewish people and their needs. There was still the problem of the Jewish question. They had no homeland. So how was this going to be resolved? And I think the emphasis that came about through the Balfour Declaration was particularly, and someone expressed it rather specially by saying, after all that the Jews have suffered under Turkish rule, a little bit with a state of modern Israel, the feeling that after all the Jews had suffered under Nazi Germany and the Holocaust, and the sympathy for the Jews and the need to provide them with some kind of homeland was not just a religious thing. It went through to the political realm and the heartbeat of many people within England, and certainly within those who've been influenced by evangelical and biblical teaching. So that was the build-up to it, and clearly people from Palmerston onwards were people who wanted to do their best by the Jewish people, and Balfour himself produced this letter of intent, which was greeted with great enthusiasm by some, not all bishops. You recall that the Zionist movement in Britain wrote to many of the bishops wanting their reactions and quotations. And there's a list of about 14 Anglican bishops and 3 Roman Catholic bishops who responded positively to that, some very enthusiastically. Some of them were, in 1918, were people who were well known as evangelical bishops, people like Bertram Pollock of Norwich, and the great Holy Mole, Hanley Mole of Durham, a great biblical scholar and a great lover of the New Testament and of the Jewish people. He spoke marvelously about welcoming the Balfour Declaration. And other people like Wat Stitchfield, the Bishop of Chelmsford, who again was an evangelical, and my own predecessor at the time. He spoke a little bit more guardedly, but then his name was Edgar Jacob, and it may be that he had got some Jewish blood in him. I've not been able to check up on that, in which case he was probably going to not be just taken in too quickly by the Zionist request for a comment. But certainly he made a positive comment. And so bishops were positive about this, and they felt that it's partly a solution. It is honouring a debt that Britain owes and that the Church owes to the Jewish people. And so if Balfour is making this a political statement, then let's go for it and see how it works out. So there was sympathy from a number of quarters. I suspect there was also skepticism from some quarters, but they didn't respond to the invitation to comment by the Zionist movement.
So again, Bishop John, in conclusion, could we summate and say that in a sense there was a certain destiny for Britain to be involved in this process from the Puritan time onwards, with people going back to the scriptures and reading the scriptures about the necessity of caring for the Jewish people, and then in the context of the mandate, Britain going out, right around the entire world. So in a sense, those two things, the Bible and the sword, in a sense, were working together. Do you think there's something of the destiny of Britain here in God's overall purposes, that she would be the modern day Cyrus to bring the Jewish people back?
I wouldn't call it destiny, though you may prefer to use that term. I would call it a sense of responsibility. After all, if Britain, through its empire, virtually ran the world, and even though that was steadily declining, nevertheless it was still significant, and if anyone was going to solve a problem, then Britain had to be in the foreground for it. So there was that sense that we must do something about it. Now, you could look at that from God's point of view and say God was working that through the whole of the 19th century and into the 20th century, and so that was God moving the hearts of people to produce this result. But certainly from the British point of view, both from the secular and political and also from the religious point of view, there was a sense we must do something, and this could well be the right answer. And of course, behind that, those who did read their Bibles did come across these passages, I will bring them into their own land. And many of those helpful suggestions and promises made by God to the people of the Old Testament, which may have been referring to the return from exile in the first instance, but they still persisted right on after the exile was completed and people were back there. So there was always that sense that the Jews longed for it, and the Christian church thought it was probably right. And there were some who were the prophecy merchants who felt that if only they could bring the Jews back there, then the second coming would happen very soon afterwards. Well, the Jews have been brought back to their own land. I say thank God for that. I think God was in it. Jesus Christ hasn't yet come again, and all the hopes and expectations of that return to the land have not been fulfilled by a long way. So God has still a lot more work to do, and the Christian church has got a lot yet to do for the Jewish people.
Bishop John Taylor, thank you very much.